everyone. Welcome to the first experimental episode of Lunar Arcana's experimental podcast series. Just nascent project here. I'm Rohini Walker, and I'm the co-creator and editor of Lunar Arcana, among other things that I do. And today I'm talking to my good friend, Dr. Catherine Svehla, who's in Colorado. She moved there recently from the desert, where she'd lived in the desert for like 20 plus years, and has escaped to Colorado, escaped the onset of the march of gentrification in the desert. She's run away. So
that isn't exactly how I put it, but there is an element of truth to that.
Well, that's probably me projecting my desire to escape the march of gentrification. Anyway, so Catherine is Catherine and I have great conversations about many, many different topics. And the other day I was mulling over a topic that is very close to my heart and very present in the work that I do, which is all about animism. A lot of what I do is focused on animism and practices around animism. And I was thinking about the differences between animism and anthropomorphism, and how the two often get confused, and how people sort of negate animism and animistic principles on the basis of confusing it with anthropomorphism. And I was thinking, that I would love to have a conversation about this with somebody. And Catherine came to mind as the ideal person whom I know to have a conversation with. So just before we dive in, I just wanted to introduce Catherine, just a brief introduction to Catherine. Dr. Catherine Svehla is a cultural mythologist and a teacher. She has a PhD in mythological studies and depth psychology, and is a storyteller, an artist, an activist. Catherine also has an amazing podcast called Myth Matters, which I highly recommend. And Catherine shares story circles and workshops, and works one-on-one with people, has online courses, and is also a member of the Joseph Campbell Foundation's Mythmaker podcast network. And you can listen to Catherine's Myth Matters podcast on mythicmojo.com. And I'll be posting all of the relevant links to Catherine's work in our little blurb on our YouTube channel, and also in the notes of our audio version of our podcast. So you can definitely, I highly recommend exploring more of Catherine's body of work.
Thank you.
Catherine.
I sound so busy when you read all of that.
Well, I was trying to summarize it, but I don't want to miss things out, because there's lots of exciting things to include in your bio. So Catherine, this topic of animism and anthropomorphism, just in your actually, let's dive in first of all with a little working definition of animism and anthropomorphism for the purposes of this conversation that we're going to be having. Feel free to jump in and add anything to these definitions that I'm missing out. So animism, the way that I experience and relate to animism is crucially from that place of relationship, of relating to other than human phenomena in the world, whether it's a rock or a mineral or a tree or a plant or an animal, as being ensouled with its own agency, having its own life force and agency moving through it, that is independent of any projections from me as a person. And anthropomorphism is more this kind of device of the imagination and psyche, where we attribute human characteristics to non-human entities and beings.
Okay, I can go with that.
Yeah.
I mean, in my words, I would say that if you have an animistic view of the world, then you see all of the others here on planet Earth with us as having an interiority. I mean, I like that you use that word, ensouled, that there's a consciousness, an intelligence, and a life there. They're not just programmed by instincts, they're individuals. And even though we might not recognize the form of their intelligence, or we don't understand, I don't understand my cat, that's for sure, but my cat is an individual, with like, and yeah, anthropomorphism, to project onto the others, something that is human, out of human experience, and think they're the same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And of course we could go so much deeper in talking and defining these two, but hopefully that will unfold through our conversation. So my first sort of, I guess the main thing that I wanted to ask you was, in your work as a cultural mythologist and storyteller, and depth psychologist, because Jung was so interested in animism and the anima, what frustrates you with this kind of this overlapping of animism and anthropomorphism that occurs?
Okay. Well, that's really it goes right to the heart of my primary frustration, which has to do with the rejection of mythology in culture, in European derived Enlightenment influenced cultures. Mythology has for a long time been seen as something kind of peripheral because it's not true. And the absence of truth, and then also the definition of mythology, what makes something a myth, is that it's not true. And the source of untruths has typically been belief systems outside of the Enlightenment model. So animism is the prime example. The Enlightenment schooled anthropologist goes to another culture, and they see God and life and soul in things other than his real God. And so they are clearly making a mistake, and their system must be a myth. And animism, that idea that the everything around us actually is alive, that it is like us, the product of a living earth, and so therefore then much more likely to be like us in those ways, then that is something that was thrown out the window with Descartes. So to answer your question, a lot of the same are the arguments that people might use to raise questions about what you do and its value in trying to help people find their way into indigenous paradigms and find out, how they can reform their own relationship to life, are the same things that I encounter, although my focus is a little bit different. So, I think, in fact, although I don't have the history at hand, I'll venture to say that if one was to look into the etymology of the term anthropomorphism, you will find that it became a word in the language at the same time that these judgments were being made about other worldviews. And that's been kind of the classic word for dismissal. Although, I mean, it is a phenomenon, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Anthropomorphism happens. It's not like it doesn't happen. And in fact, it even has value, which is a thing I could talk about later if you want me to. But it's usually been used to say it's all make-believe because we know what's true. And my work is about dismantling those assumptions on every level.
Yeah, and you mentioned that this onset of since really the Enlightenment, when this kind of dismissal of animism really took shape in civilized society, as just these kind of strange flights of fancy, common in primitive cultures, that pray to like rocks or the weather or the wind or have a relationship with. And I think that's this, and I forgot to say at the beginning, we're recording this on Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, happy belated Earth Day, although every day is Earth Day. But yeah, just this, this coming into relationship with all life as being animate and having a soul and a spirit. That's common to pretty much all indigenous earth-based cultures around the world that exist still, or that have existed in the past and that have now been wiped out. And it's that kind of so in the Enlightenment, it was that the separation of spirit and matter. Descartes, all this, he was one of the founding fathers of like spirit and matter don't have anything to do with each other. And and this kind of like materialistic view that an object is just an object, whether that's a tree or a tree grows, but that's because of these chemical biological things that are taking place. There's no agency that's happening because we can't understand it from a human perspective. And that's where the anthropomorphism element comes in, I guess, because then when we attribute these humanistic qualities to it, it's like, okay, well, a child would do that, or I would do that from my imagination because I want to be able to relate to this tree, and the only way I can do it is by attributing human qualities.
Right. I mean, there's a whole history which I have only a little familiarity with. There's a whole history of relationship between us and other animals and beings. And there are a number of thinkers who have very eloquently demonstrated, I think, the fact that when we emerged and as our consciousness started developing, animals were really our first partners in terms of understanding how to live and also coming to identify ourselves. I mean, I've heard this term of kinship, because kinship is likeness with the difference, so if you think about like your sister, you are so like your sister, and yet you are not your sister. And I think that notion of kinship is really crucial to the animistic viewpoint, because difference is very important in that paradigm. It doesn't say humans and animals are the same. It says that humans and animals, though, have so much in common, and it's like working in those commonalities or whatever. And the, that conversation of like, how are we like animals or not like animals, and what do we learn from them, and how does what we learn about other creatures, critters, plants, rocks, the things around us, how does that inform the way that we organize our societies? That's been changing for a long time. And a lot of people would say agriculture and domesticating animals was a huge watershed moment in terms of, what's our relationship to the rest of the organic world and then the planet. But I do think the Enlightenment is particularly important in the conversation that we would be having here, because today most of us are living in and encountering the problems introduced by that idea that somehow magically we emerged from the earth, but we're the only conscious beings here. And we're the only ones who have language or like make decisions. And everything else is sort of pre-programmed to just fulfill its mission, I think it's ludicrous, but there are so many layers of prejudice and so many ideas behind it that, you have to do more than make an intellectual decision to, abandon it.
Exactly. And I think, what I always come back to when I think about animism as distinct from anthropomorphism, and speaking of animism, you can probably hear my dog scratching in the background. We like to keep things organic around here. So is that, with in Native American cultures, there's this tradition of asking for permission from the land before any planting happens, or before anything happens on the land. And that is different to like attributing human qualities onto the land and, waiting for the land to give a reply in human language. It's stopping, it's dropping into a different space within yourself and listening from that non-mental, intellectualizing, rationalizing space, and like listening and then asking and waiting for answers to come in non-verbal ways. Mm-hmm. And that's really what, that's really what sort of earth-based cultures are so beautifully adept at. And that's, and that is relating to something in an animistic way. Like it's not that this rock is going to tell me in English what it wants me to do, but it might tell me in my dreams. It might tell me through, it's like paying attention to the other ways that the world and the cosmos and the earth and the universe speaks to us, which can sound, from the kind of very strictly materialist paradigm, it's like, oh, that's just woo-woo new age hippie stuff. But, and you can dismiss that if you like, but that to me that's the epitome of the colonialist perspective of just dismissing it, which, comes from, when I say colonialist perspective, I mean that kind of, just that separation of spirit and matter. And, that those are primitive cultures that we don't pay any attention to, and they need to be civilized into rational beings.
Right. Yeah. Maybe listening to you, I'm thinking about, a couple of things. One, this particular topic in the field of mythology often gets described as, is part of the interpretation of mythology as being a primitive science. So one way that the and I think colonizing is a good word, because this enlightenment paradigm we're talking about, and the sort of the hegemony of white male European, that is the they did the colonizing. The idea that so these people didn't understand how the world works, so they had myth. They said that, like, the monkey got his tail this way, but we have science, so we know this other thing. And so I want to, having said that, then I want to introduce, I think it's Paul Shepard who kind of unpacked this in a way that I understood it. But you could also say, well, so for each of us, human children, human beings, obviously one of our first tasks is to build a sense of self. We were born, we don't have that. It's something that we acquire through being in the world with other people, but also with everything. And it's a process of going, I am like this, I am not like that. I have this, and animals and plants, but animals in particular are an incredibly important part of that process. Many people would say, and I agree, that it's part of our psychic, if not material DNA, from the hunter-gatherer, the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, we pay attention to animals. There's an inborn sense that they have significance. So anyway, they're part of our conversation partners. Who am I? Oh, I am like the dog. I'm also not like the dog. And there's a phase then in childhood where those relationships are very important. And anthropomorphizing happens a lot as part of the imaginal engagement of this identification process. What happens, though, is that, you grow out of it, but in the culture that we are unfortunately mostly being dominated by, and that you and I are critiquing here in this conversation, what you grow into is an idea that there's nothing there. It's only you and other people. So what happens is you only relate to the world, the others, imaginatively. You keep anthropomorphizing as if you were still 5. When really the mature progression is to be able to have enough ego strength to be like, okay, so I know who I am. And so now I can comfortably exist in this world where there are radically different others. And so then I have the space to do exactly what you're suggesting, to recognize that I'm dependent on the earth, duh. So there's a relationship there that is foundational. Cultivating it makes sense.
Yeah.
And my conversation partner in it, the earth, is going to participate from its being in the same way that I'm going to participate as a human, whatever that might mean, using my senses, moving, ritual, whatever. And it's going to be different, the two sides of the conversation.
Exactly. And it's, it's this, because anthropomorphism, like you say, it's a natural function of the imagination that happens very organically when you're a child, and in like fairy tales and all of these kinds of things. And it's a natural function of the human psyche. And I think one of the reasons that it kind of happens in this natural way is this need to make the other phenomena in life more familiar from a human perspective. And I think what underlies that need for familiarity is this innate sense of, oh, this thing, this tree is actually animate, like you can sense it. But then how do you, so in order to kind of like package that sensory input up into something that feels familiar and relatable to you, ascribe human qualities and attributes to it. So I think it's like the anthropomorphism comes from this innate knowing that, oh, everything is alive. Oh, but then how do I relate to it? Oh, I'll make it, I'll personify it. I'll give it human characteristics, rather than going, oh, and because animism has been relegated to the scrap heap of primitivism. It's not like, oh, okay, how can I relate to this other than human being that's not going to speak English or any other verbal linear language, and it's not going to have the same human qualities and characteristics that I'm familiar with. So I think it's coming from this need for familiarity, because it feels completely unsafe and alien to be like, how am I going to relate to this rock or this tree or this plant or this animal?
Right. Yeah. There's the absence of context, and this is why the work that you're doing, is so important. There's no, if we were living in a world where the inherent logic it's so obvious. I keep laughing. I'm sorry, but it's like, yeah, is anyone really confused about whether or not we're animals? Because we don't live in a culture that has that mature view. And so then we don't grow up like being schooled in, because we are schooled in all of our cultural assumptions. Because we don't have that, then, we're just like left hanging. They're in the anthropomorphic stage, if you care about animals, and to move out of that, you have to really work it yourself, and find people to work with. You have to care enough to really start looking at the underlying assumptions and your own experience. And I love that you brought this sensory, that we know, we just know. We do, that we're not the only things here that have consciousness and intelligence and interiority, and to relate that to the sort of historical, mythological, whatever part of the conversation I'm holding down here. Another important thing I think to understand about Descartes and the split and enlightenment and everything, and again, this predates, because it really goes back to the roots of Christianity and other kind of monotheisms, is the idea, well, and Plato, now that I think about it, is that your senses are not a reliable source of information about the world. So if a person, like maybe someone who's listening to this conversation, if you start unpacking the assumptions that prevent you from experimenting, with a different worldview, I'd suggest to you that another one that you'll find is that the fantasy of reason has at its core the idea that if you didn't think it, and here you can see right away the problem, because how the hell do you think about anything that isn't in the world, that you aren't encountering in another form, but hey, they put brackets around that, then you can't trust it. And that's what Descartes' basic thing of I think, therefore I am. That is what it means. So it means even though I am a scientist in the early 1800s and I can hear the dog screaming, I'm going to cut it apart while it's alive anyway, because it's a machine. It's ludicrous. And it is your senses that take you into, it is your senses that I think can actually be the place where you can have experience and also be able to start distinguishing experience from imagination.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And, you know, it's going back to, you know, the whole notion of Descartes and I think, therefore I am, and this split, you know, I think it was Descartes who was in a kind of Socratic dialogue with himself, with a kind of archetype in his psyche, and he was getting all this information, and that is a very animistic way of creating, you know, of giving life to a force in your psychic world, and having a dialogue with it, and then going, okay, well, this is the information I've been given from, and then now that's, you know, so much of his work is still the bedrock of science, although that's changing. But yeah, I think that's, you know, and coming back to this whole notion of the senses and the body, like how we relate to the sensations in our body allows us to start being able to discern what is being projected by us and what is actually, because again, the sensations in our bodies and the movements in our psyches, you know, like Jung, you know, he was one of the main proponents of, you know, having the, you know, forces in our psyche have autonomous agency that we can relate to. So, you know, and again, it's this relating in this non-verbal, non-human ascribed way, although we can, in order to make art and turn that initial relationship into something, we can then anthropomorphize it, perhaps, you know, and that's probably where like a lot of fairy tales and things come from this original being able to relate from this very organic way into, okay, now this is the personality that this house has, you know, the old woman who lived in a shoe or whatever, you know.
Right. Yeah. There's a real mix there of, I think, of it's hard to say because no one really knows like where fairy tales come from. With the exception of, I mean, there are some literary fairy tales and they were written, and we know, you know, Hans Christian Andersen, we know he wrote those. Though it's a whole other topic of like, where does the inspiration for these things come from? What layer of the psyche, you know, and what's going on there in terms of the autonomy of the ideas themselves. But what was I going to say? You were talking about, the senses. I mean, one of the things that has happened to us, and again, it's been going on for a long time, but is the alienation from our own animal self. And there is a relationship, maybe it's obvious, but I'll say it anyway, you know, if we have fears about our animal nature and conceive that to be, you know, characteristics that we then project onto animals, you know. So we think of certain animals as being cruel or this, that, or whatever. And the cruelty is a human characteristic. It's not something that happens in the natural world as far as we know. We miss the fact that it also is part of our alienation from our physicality. And that's connected again to this distrust of the senses. So the notion of animism and anthropomorphism and, the debate between those two things also really has implications for our relationship to our own embodiment and our ability to discern our own experience, to pay close enough attention to it and take it seriously enough to be able to really know what's going on. And I think that is another part of people's confusion, confusion in terms of understanding experiences that other people share with them, and also confusion in their own, because something happens, but it's like, is it real or not? Well, it's real. The question is really, is it a function of your psychology, or is it an interaction, of a different sort?
Yeah, and it is that, that coming into the space of being able to discern again, whether it's a function of your psyche or whether it is an actual exchange that you're having with another being, is again, it's this very slow process of like stopping, slowing down, listening from not just our ears, but from our heart and from our whole being. And that's something that we've become, so disconnected from in our culture and society. And it's like, it's just the information input that's coming in, in this very linear linguistic way, where, it's the slowing down is, and creating the space to just not rush a response, or not rush an outcome, and just being, which is again going back to this, that whole notion of understanding what indigeneity is. And this is, again, all cultures around the world that really live and have lived in this relational way with the earth. And and this is where myth to me is as well, this is why I love your work, and I bring myth into my own work, is it really allows you, even though there's anthropomorphizing in story, it like really allows you to go beyond that into like, so anthropomorphizing something is almost a doorway into the deeper relationship that you can have with an archetype, or with a plant, or a rock, or a being, or a spirit entity, or anything that strikes us, or even like a vignette in a story. It's almost like a doorway into it. So just having this conversation, I'm feeling like perhaps that's where the kind of the use of anthropomorphizing beyond a nice function of the psyche when you're a child comes in. It's like this opening into this invitation into this deeper relationship.
Right. Yeah, it's a portal. I mean, as you know, the way that I use mythology is as a portal, because, well, for lots of reasons, but for purposes of our conversation here, the world that's described in what we now call myth is by and large not the world that we are living in, or we think we're living in. And so that means that they are very useful conversation partners for unpacking your own world view and assumptions, and being able to see yourself. One of the things that is, well, how do I put this? One of the ways that I feel that mythology, that the popular use of mythology, and this is something that, I think about, that is really kind of my version of maybe your conversation about animism versus anthropomorphism. Okay, so in my world, I think about it as like myth is metaphor and where is it not? Because a lot of the doorways that have been opened to a broader appreciation for myth and have really kind of created the context for the sort of work that I do rest on the idea that we can all, use these stories and we can all enter into all of this and we can find these common meanings because it's metaphor. And that's true. It is a symbolic language. That is the definition of mythology. However, why is there a horse in that myth and not a dog? Why is the protagonist a parrot? And so there's a place where I think that in the rush to once again, like kind of create a more familiar ground, that lets us out of the box of our, incredibly rigid, one-sided consciousness, reason, fantasy, whatever you want to call it. We're all yearning for something else, but then, in the rush to get that, then again, it's mostly an emphasis on similarity and psychology. And I am currently thinking more and more and more about, well, how do I bring back into the conversation the literal truth and the world knowledge that informs the myths. Is this making sense? Because I'm kind of thinking it through as we're talking.
It is.
Mythology, it is a science, but because it comes from a time when people didn't have the mistaken idea that somehow science and poetry were choices. And we're still doing that. Oh, well, am I thinking or am I imagining? It's like, it's not that clear, folks. You're doing both. And so you're doing both. And so
it goes back to Descartes having created his whole body, well, not his whole body of work, but it's much of his accepted body of work, his rational, from having had a conversation with a being in his head.
Yeah.
And, in a Socratic exchange, and
yeah.
It's that like you say, it's that I think before this before the Enlightenment, and I'm not knocking the Enlightenment in any way, I'm just saying that's when the kind of split between spirit and matter happened, and that became the kind of bedrock of educated, reasonable, civilized society, where this whole other aspect of the psyche was literally made unconscious, and that includes the way that we relate to other than human beings in the world. And it's and whereas and then so when you find the kind of European colonizer coming out here or to other parts of the world, and they see these primitive people like praying to this rock or this tree, or like it's like, oh my goodness, these people need to be civilized, and 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 you think, well, no, they were in touch with this whole deep well of not just their own psyches, but the, you know, in Jung's words, the collective unconscious. And it's that, you know, it's that richness, and it's like science, and, you know, like you say, mythology is a science, and I totally, you know, yes, completely, because it's this idea of science being separate from anything that is unmeasurable. So anything that's, you know, not measurable by scientific instruments is to be fully rejected and negated into the world of the woo-woo. Is, you know, it's like, but science exists, you know, science exists in consciousness. Everything exists in consciousness, including our relationality to other than human beings. And it's, you know, so it's, animism is not anti-science. It includes science and permeates science, because that science was born from this dialogue that some, you know, people were having with themselves, with archetypes within themselves.
Yeah. Well, science is a method, you know. I mean, it's not a body of information, you know, it's a method. I mean, the scientific method, you know, I mean, so whenever you are observing, collecting information through your senses, coming up with ideas about what may or may not mean, you know, and that can be conceptual meaning, or it can be significance, like, you know, on a more mechanical level. Oh, does that mean that if I do this, that's going to happen? You know, I mean, it could be on lots of different levels. And, you know, finding out, you know, like testing so I think part of what you were alluding to in you're bringing psyche into the conversation is been the dismissal of a lot of depth psychology in Jung's work, and Freud, but especially Jung. He said it was a science, and people were like, it can't possibly be, you know, because we can't see what you're working with. You know, but he was using a scientific method. Now we have phenomenology, so we have a whole body of a whole discipline, given the way we do things, but that's informing science and philosophy and psychology and everything else. It has to say psychic phenomenon is real. So if you approach it with using the scientific method, you are doing science. And that, again, the logic of that seems very obvious to me. I also want to bring in, though, because I think it's, I guess I'm sort of on this, like, oh, I want to take apart all the binaries, all the places where you think you have to choose. You have to be this way or that way. Let's take on another one. So, you know, how a person can explore this, you know, do their own experiment and like kind of deconstructing, trying to get out of the box and go, oh, okay, where am I? Like, am I stuck in anthropomorphism, or like, how do I get out of that? Or like, how do I, you know, I want to be in a world in a different way. So one thing that we've been talking about is just senses, just that the more familiar you are with your bodily experience of things, the better able you are to discern between different types of experiences. And you've mentioned several times, it's very important, you know, to cultivate a way of being that in the world that is about watching and being quiet and listening, so that you actually know what's around you. And those, so I could imagine someone right now thinking that it's mostly, this feeling state kind of experience. And so I want to say again, yes, and also it's about thinking. It's not indigenous cultures or not like just all like sort of touchy feely kind of, if you investigate them, you will find very rich philosophical, intellectual traditions. And what you're going to discover is that the difference is that the world, they've stayed in touch with reality, the natural world in formulating those ideas, whereas in many cases, our European Enlightenment influenced cultures or whatever are the ones actually that have gone off into woo-woo land, just entertaining their own ideas out of a certain addiction to solipsism or something. And so if you really want to like investigate an intellectual tradition that is grounded, you're going to find it in these other cultures. So in addition to the feeling, well, I'm just going to use kind of generalizing, but in addition to the feeling type suggestions that you and I have been making, I would say that there is an intellectual and knowledge component, which has to do with investigating other cultures, their intellectual traditions, and understanding, like art, for example, or ritual, or like, what's the idea there? We will find very, very sophisticated ideas. And then also, I think one of the things that hampers many of us is our ignorance about the others around us. You go out of your house and there's a tree. And it's like, well, how much do you actually know about trees? Do you know what kind of tree that is? And I feel compelled to bring that in because I think that part of the criticism of your work, my work, whatever, is again that somehow it's like out in the ether, when actually to properly understand it and work in it, there's quite a lot of information and study and like real knowledge, like really of the topic itself. It's not just sitting around like figuring out how you feel on any given day. You can tell I have feelings about this.
Yeah, no, well, I do. And, I'm quietly going yes to everything you're saying because, yeah, and I just really want to highlight the point that you made about this, because this is something that I also feel, and my experience of it, there's kind of like this versus that binary modality in Enlightenment onwards is, again, yeah, it's this kind of solipsistic, like it's only within this framework that something can exist and have value and be taken seriously, rather than seeing like the whole outside of the specific model of the materialist agenda, where it's and when I say agenda, I don't mean that in it. It's just, there is a kind of worldview. It's okay, maybe switch agenda for worldview. It's it is that, yeah, that these cultures, these traditions, these ways have more than just like, oh, I'm feeling this particular way. It's more than just pure subjectivity. it is grounded in really, really, it's where all of our ancestry comes from the world over. And, you know, it goes back to the whole, notion of all, you know, to all my relations, it's, you know, it's like human, non-human, other than human, you know, like I look at like mushrooms as our oldest ancestors. And again, that can be dismissed as, you know, oh, she's just talking nonsense now. That, you know, that's how I relate to mushrooms. Like, that's how I actually, in a very, very real way. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring mushrooms into the conversation, because as we've been talking, one of the things I was thinking about is Sheldrake. Do you know about Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life?
Yeah, I haven't read it, but
yeah, I'm most of the way through it, and there was a review of the book in the New York Times Review of Books, I think it was, the reviewer just was awesome. I mean, she approached the book with some very interesting questions, and that was part of what motivated me to read it. But so I want to take what you just said. So what you just said, your feeling about mushrooms, oldest ancestors. Okay, so yeah, so someone could go, well, okay, but you know, then you go and you read actual science, you know, and again, like I hate, we don't have any other word for it, because I hate that we call this science and that not science, because science is a method. It's a way of approaching things. But so you go and read his book and you discover that right now, the most complete view of the evolution of life is that algae and lichens had to partner up in order for life to move out of the water onto the land, and mycelium, as something that was produced by the union, were the early roots. And so there really was no earth, there could really be no life on earth, on the ground, in soil, you know, without that. And then it just goes on from there. You know, I mean, another thing that's in the book that I'm really thinking a lot about is the question of what's an individual, you know, and you can find this in books other than Sheldrake's, but specifically, there's something like 70% of your body is actually other organisms. It's an astonishing number, you know, so you realize it's like, oh, actually, and this is material, on the material level. This isn't just, I'm a city, you know, so, and so then what exactly, who's talking?
Well, yeah, now we're getting,
you know, I mean, there's some really
consciousness studies, and yeah, that's the next conversation we have.
very, very, very interesting information, you know, about how things work and our dependencies on things. And, you know, one of the early books about who's training who, kind of, you know, was Paulin's book, Botany of Desire, which is still a really good book for people who haven't read it, you know, about, did we really cultivate these plants, or have they actually made us who we are through cultivating them in the ways that, so our interactions with the world, you know, with the earth and the others here, are far more complex and like interwoven than we are led to believe. And I say led to believe, not because I'm a big conspiratorialist or whatever, but just, we don't get taught this stuff. You have to go and look for it. you know, in our mainstream, you know, education and the way we're brought up and the stories we're told and what our parents show us and all of that, this isn't there. So that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could, yeah, I know that we could, I'm keeping an eye on time, and I really want to talk more, and maybe just a couple more minutes. But I mean, I think there might be a part 2 to this conversation. But yeah, I mean, everything that you've said, I know that we're singing from the same hymn sheet, and it's, you know, it's that, you know, you mentioning that book, because I've got that as like in my books to buy list, and again, it's this felt sense that, yeah, we are related to mushrooms as some of our earliest ancestors, but how do I, you know, is this just a flight of fancy that I'm having, or is this because of something, you know, just an intuition, like an intuition that is arising, that, okay, now I need to go and have that proven by the scientific methodology, and lo and behold, you know, so it's like these things that are intuited are not always to be dismissed, because they're coming from, but it's like when we're settled into that space where we're not, you know, we're not grasping for this or that answer, that the answer arises. That, you know, and like, you know, what you were saying touched upon, you know, consciousness, and because our bodies contain all of these different organisms and entities and beings, essentially, that we are home to, you know, that is also calls our body, this one body, home. And here we are on the earth, all of these different organisms on this one, you know, and it's like, so then we're getting into the realm of like, yes, who am I and what is this consciousness? And it's the one in the many, and the many in the one. And you know, and that's where this being able to relate to each other comes from. Yeah.
Well, as you know, I feel I have the same feeling about mushrooms, and those experiences have been like singular, you know, and helpful in the process of discerning other experiences. You know, I mean, I've had a number of experiences over the years that don't fit into the paradigm that I was given. And so that's part of why, you know, I've so enjoyed this conversation, and why I feel like it's an important one to have, because I think more and more and more people are looking for places to put those experiences, or understand the hollowness of what they are calling their lives right now. And so doing the work of, you know, really looking at these things as concepts, and thinking about the history and the assumptions, and, you know, being able to give yourself permission to do something different for to understand things in a different way. I mean, I think it's crucial. So, and this topic, once I started thinking about it, after you asked me, you know, if I would be into it, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of how it impacts what my universe, of my professional universe. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that you thought of me.
Well, thank you for agreeing to because I was, you know, I was a bit like Descartes, having this conversation with
only not like Descartes.
except not like Descartes. But yeah, and I was like, well, it would be nice to actually have this conversation with another person, and the first person was, yes, Catherine. So I'm excited that we were able to make this happen, and you know, maybe there will be follow-ups, because I feel that we could talk more on this. yeah, I think wrap it up for now. Reluctantly.
Right. Yeah, no, there's
Um,
not going to be any neat place. I guess I'll say that if anyone who listens to this wants to communicate with me in any way about it, I would love to hear from you. If you go to my website, mythicmojo.com, which Rohini is going to post, there's a contact me, email me, whatever. That'd be great. So
yeah, and same here, anyone who's inspired by this conversation or has something to add or questions, same here. Please reach out. And yes, I'm excited for whatever our next conversation, because we talk a lot, so may as well make them
right.
public. Yeah. Wow, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was great. And yeah, I'll be posting all of Catherine's links and information so you can find out more about her work. And I really, really highly recommend her podcast. It's wonderful, really, really, really great. And yeah, thanks for tuning in to Lunar Arcana's first ever, hopefully first of many more podcast episodes. And yeah, thank you. See you
Happy
again
Earth
soon.
Day.
Happy Earth Day. Bye.
Bye.